Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Chandler Petrak. I want to help you know the Bible and encounter the God behind it. I'm super excited today because on Holy Middle Podcast, we have a Bible scholar, and I don't say that just for the flattery of it. We have an actual Bible scholar, and I'm super excited because I have a lot of questions, and I think you'll benefit a lot from hearing from him. I've benefited so much in my life from listening to him. But Dr. French, welcome to the Holy Middle Podcast, first off.
Thank you for having me, Chandler. It's very good to be here.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Could you tell everybody who's watching about yourself just for a minute so they know who you are?
Yeah. So, I'm Dr. Nathan French. I am an assistant professor of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Near Eastern Studies here at Oral Roberts University. I hold a master's degree from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in really Bible and the Near East, and then a PhD from the University of Aberdeen in Hebrew Bible and Near Eastern Studies. My wife and I both teach together. My wife is she also has a PhD in practical theology, and she teaches in the counseling program here. She's also a licensed mental health professional, so she teaches in the same college, different department, teaches counseling here. We have two sons, Ezra and Boaz, 7 and 4, and we just love them dearly, are having a wonderful time together teaching and raising our boys. So I was I did my undergrad at Oral Roberts University, and am so happy to be back here teaching in my alma mater. Just love this place and what the Lord is doing here. So,
yeah. Well, thank you so much for bringing on Dr. French again. You know, Dr. French, people don't know this, but a lot of different things. First thing is, ever since I was a teenager, I knew that I wanted to do my doctorate, but I didn't know what I wanted to do it in. And so for those that are watching and listening, Dr. French has played a pivotal role in my life, probably more than you know Dr. French, with my doctorate and what I'm doing now and helping me choose which route to take. And then also your wife, Dr. French, she has also been a great influence on my wife, who also works at ORU as she's doing her master's in professional counseling. So when I think Bible scholar, I think Dr. French, Dr. Nathan French. So I just want to say thank you, and I'm super excited for us to talk about these things. But without further ado, Dr. French, are you ready to get into the first question?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay,
yeah.
okay. This is the first one. I have it here. So I'm just going to try to do it line upon line, precept upon precept, so I don't get distracted. Okay, so talking about Genesis, I love what you've done on Genesis. I've heard you talk about it, but I'm excited because I get to press it a little bit deeper right now. Okay, so my first question is this. What does it mean to read Genesis as an ancient Near Eastern text rather than a modern scientific account? And by that, you know, I've heard a lot of debate and a lot of discussion over the if we can read Genesis and that account as a creation story, or as some would think as like a scientific formula for how the earth was conceived. Yeah. But what do you think about that? What is the difference between the two?
Yeah, no, this is a very good question. I think, and again, I appreciate all your kind words. Thank you. It's good to know you and your wife. We really enjoyed getting to know you both. So, thank you again for having me on.
Yes,
to answer that question, I think it's important to remember that the ancients were just as interested in what we call cosmology and how the world came about and the world in which we live. Talking about it, thinking about it, giving narrative, giving context to it. And so in one sense, yes, in the book of Genesis, we have the creation story of Genesis 1. We also have somewhat of another creation story in Genesis 2 to 3, sort of side by side. And so we often think of Genesis as a story of beginnings. In fact, that's how it begins. Bereshit, right? In the beginning, or We could even use the word when, actually, when at the start.
Yes.
Maybe talk about here a little bit. But the truth is, that's just one small part of Genesis. Really, the book of Genesis is, yes, the beginning of all things, but also a deeper question and answer to the beginning of Israel. And so it actually will take us into most of Genesis, really, 12 to 50, is centered upon Abraham and his descendants. And it's trying to set up the entire narrative of the Pentateuch, that is, the first 5 books of Moses that are going to come afterwards. So if we could think of it, Genesis 1 through 11 is trying to get us to chapter 12. And then from there, it is setting us up for what's coming after, which will be the great Exodus moment in which the nation of Israel comes forth as the people of God, as he delivers them out of slavery. So you asked the question, how are we to weigh read it in a Near Eastern sense or in a scientific sense? Well, because of the cosmology and the creation narratives, I think a lot of these earlier texts, especially Genesis 1 to 3, maybe 1 to 4, but especially Genesis 1 to 2, 4a, this text especially is often compared to our own cosmology, our own narrative, our own sort of larger myth, as you would say, our larger origin story that we tell ourselves in the post-enlightened world, the modern world in which we live. We like to compare both of those cosmologies. But the issue is that the ancients weren't asking the same questions that we're asking. Also, the ancients weren't thinking in the same terms that we're thinking. There's a great scholar out there who has this phrase. He says, the Bible was written for us, but the Bible was not written to us. It was written to another people at another time and another place. Yep. And what he means by that is that we have to come to the text on its own terms. And what is the text that we have received from the ancients? Well, it's an ancient Near Eastern book, right? So all of these texts that we have received are ancient Near Eastern texts. More specifically, they are sort of West Semitic, so they're part of the West Semitic world that's dividing the Semitic world down to whether it's East or West, or even talking about the North and the South. We're really at the West Semitic world, and even further, a further delineation would be that this is ancient Israel. So yes, this is an ancient Israelite Near Eastern text. And so what we need to do is we need to be able to come to these texts and read them in their ancient context, because we need to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And what I mean by that is these peoples are the ones who gave us their text. We ought to love them enough to know about their culture, to know about the words of their languages, so that we can read their text faithfully as the church. And I always tell my students, I say, I don't know. I mean, look, I didn't write the text. I had a professor who used to say this. I loved it when he would say it. He goes, I didn't write the text, right? And we need to get back to that understanding. Look, we didn't write the text. And if we truly want to know what the Holy Spirit has said to us through the text, then we have to love our ancestors, the people who have provided us this text, enough to ask the important questions to understand what they have written down and ultimately what it means. And I don't. This is what I say to my students. This is how the Lord has designed it. I don't know why He designed it this way, but this is what He wants. It's the glory of God, as I like to say, to conceal a matter. It's the glory of kings to search out a matter. In this particular case, so no, I don't think that we need to pit science against the ancient Near Eastern reading. What we need to do is say, okay, the methodology of science and how we understand the world and how we understand our own place in the world today is not how the ancients were reading Genesis 1 through 11 or Genesis. They were coming at it from different terms, and there's real meaning for us to discover there. So
that's so good. Beautifully said. So you threw something out there for a second, and I have to grab onto it a little bit. You mentioned, I think is So in the beginning, Genesis 1:1,
Yes.
that's
Bereshit.
Bereshit, right? Bereshit.
Yes. Very good.
So some translations, specifically in Jewish, in the Hebrew text, will translate to when God began to create versus in the beginning. So you mentioned it, so I wanted to press you a little bit further on that for a second. Which one do you think fits better? And if it is one over the other, do you feel like that affects the overall narrative of Genesis?
Yeah.
What does that mean for us?
Yeah. Well, the way that the text is pointed in the Masoretic text, I don't want to get too technical here, but essentially the text that we have received in the Masoretic text, which has the vowel points in the Hebrew text, different from what we have, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is just a consonantal Hebrew text. We have the pointing there that in a nutshell, it is better translated when God created. Or some might say when God began to create. In this case, it would be Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. So when God began to create the heavens and the earth. And this makes good sense because when you go to verse 2, it then says, Ve'ha'aretz hayta tohu vavohu. So, and the earth was formless and void, or it was tohu vavohu. I mean, that's really what you want to say, tohu vavohu. And so this flows nicely if this beginning sentence is stated in the way that it is, with the construct state that it's in. So anyways, all that to say, it's probably better translated when God began to create the heaven and the earth. But as you know, this creates an issue. And what is the issue? It means that Genesis opens at a point in time in which God has already begun creating the heavens and the earth. Different than if you were to say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, full stop, right?
Yes.
So I think there could be tension there to say that there was something there before the beginning. But I both in Jewish understanding and in Christian, it is clear that God created everything, the God of Israel. And so I don't think there's any tension there. It also makes sense, too, because when we do compare to other ancient Near Eastern cosmologies, other creation myths, like, for example, one of the most significant ones, the Enuma Elish, well, it actually begins in the exact same way, when on high. And so it almost begins in the same sort of structure. So it makes good sense that this would be the way that this opens up in this way with Bereshit bara. Now, again, I think you could go with either translation, and with the translations that you have, there is a way to repoint the text to go against the Masoretic text that we received with the vowel points, in which you could, in fact, try to argue that it is in the beginning God created. So that's why you're going to get some translations going with in the beginning God created and when God began to create heaven and earth.
So fascinating. Okay, so maybe we can get back into tohu vavohu later.
Oh, yeah, okay.
That is one question with the pre-Adamic race. But for now, I'm really curious about this. And maybe you could talk about your expertise in this area.
Sure.
Specifically, here's a question. Should the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life be read literally, symbolically, or both? And follow-up question to that, which I hear people talk about so much, commonly depicted today, is, was the fruit an apple?
An apple, yes.
Yes. What are your thoughts?
So, yeah, this is a very good question. Genesis 1 through 11 is replete with metaphorical language and literal language. And I'll say this right off the bat. Genesis 1 through 11 intends its readers to read it as history. There's no question in my mind that that's how Genesis 1 through 11 wants you to read the text. This is history. Nevertheless, we have something that we call antediluvian and post-diluvian time, i.e. pre-flood time and after-flood time. After-flood time is much more part of our reality presently. That's the way the biblical text wants you to understand it.
Hmm.
Antediluvian or pre-flood time, there's something different going on with regard to reality. Now, it's still part of our reality. It's part of our continuation. There's no sense in which that part has not continued into our reality. But something drastic changes after the flood. And the ancient Near Eastern world understood that as much as Genesis 1 through 11 understood it. There is sort of a demarcating line between what we would call the prehistorical time, the time wherein from which we don't have text to tell us historically all of the details that we need to know, to the time in which we do have history and we've started to write down as humans what our past is. So think of the very ancient past as Genesis 1 through 11, especially that antediluvian pre-flood moment and the post-flood. So that said, yes, I think Genesis 2 to 3 is wanting you to read it in a very true way.
Hmm.
Literal is the wrong word. Okay, literal and metaphorical. I don't think these words really help us. I think we need to get the conceptual framework of what is happening in Genesis 2 to 3. And it definitely assumes that there are real humans, there are real players. The actions that are happening are real actions that have impact upon even us today. Okay, so I think
Mm.
that's a good place to start. So,
Yeah.
with regard to the two trees themselves, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life, there's no doubt that that Genesis 2 to 3, what we call the Eden narrative, it is structured around these two trees. The trees start in Genesis 2:9. Interesting, God causes all the trees to come out of the garden. And then you have this phrase right at the end of verse 9, so what you have
Mm.
here is, you can almost imagine telling this to children, right? Or
Hmm.
with that sort of rhythm behind it. The tree of life was in the middle of the garden, or in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so from 2:9, you go to 2:16 and 17, and you have that they can eat from any of the trees of the garden, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat of it, for on the day that you eat of it, you will die, or you will be put to death. Essentially, it's a death threat. And then you come to Genesis 3, 1 to 5, and the Nachash is trying to get them to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then you come to 3:22, and you have a reference to the knowledge of good and evil on the lips of the Lord himself. I
Mm.
shouldn't say the lips of the Lord, but there is somewhat of an embodied God in Genesis 2 to 3. So, coming from the Lord himself in his statement that he makes regarding humans having received Ladat Tovera, having received the knowledge of good and evil. And then you have the tree of life. It appears again, all of a sudden. Tree of life at the beginning, tree of life at the end, tree of the knowledge of good and evil all throughout the rest of the narrative. And so there's no doubt that these two trees are central to the text. So you say, well, what is happening? Are these literal trees or not? Well, what they represent is absolutely literal in this sense. And again, I don't necessarily like this language as much, but what I mean is that the text is wondering about divine knowledge and divine life. So these humans, we know they're created in the image of God. That means at its bare minimum, the tselem of the Lord, the tselem of God himself, the image of God, tselem being that word for image.
Mm.
That first and foremost means that these are the offspring of the Lord. These are his children. The man and the woman represent his children. They don't just represent, they are actually his offspring. That's the idea that comes through in being a tselem. Well, if you're going to be the image of the Lord, Genesis 2 to 3 picks this up. And what do the images of the Lord need? These children of the Lord, they need divine knowledge and they need divine life.
Mm.
And the question that the Near Easterners were always asking, you have this replete throughout other Near Eastern texts like the Adapa myth. You have it somewhat in the Gilgamesh epic as well. How is it that humans can have divine wisdom, that they can be wise like the divine beings, like God himself that we see in Genesis 2 to 3, but not have divine life, that is, immortal bodily life? humans die. And so the question really throughout the Near East is, why is it humans are so much like the gods or like the divine beings, but yet so much not like them in that they don't have immortality? And so that is the question of Genesis 2 to 3, is how is it that we entered into this problem of sin and death? And the answer to that is, well, it centers around whatever the knowledge of good and evil is. And that's where the fun really starts, when you start asking, what is Hada'at Tovei Ra? What is the knowledge of good and evil in that sense? So when it comes to was it an apple, well, that comes from the Latin Vulgate, because you have in Latin, you have malum, which means apple, and you have the shortened form of that, malum, which means evil. And so there was a mistake, I guess, an interpretation that you would think that is an apple that they ate from. And you see that in so much of the artwork from that point forward. Clearly it's a fig, right? Clearly it's a fig tree of some sort, because what do they use to cover themselves as they were right there in the midst of the garden? They use fig leaves. No, I'm sort of joking, but that is one of the great ancient Jewish interpretations, was that it was a fig on that level. So,
Yeah, that's so good. Okay, so when I really got into reading Genesis, really started learning biblical Hebrew, I didn't realize how much I had to consider other creation narratives.
Yeah.
One thing that I learned in Old Testament class, one of the first classes I took in my undergrad was Old Testament, and we learned about how there are other creation narratives and how, in many ways, Genesis 1 and 2 is a polemic to other creation narratives, like you had mentioned, the Enuma Elish. Could you talk about those creation narratives and how do those affect the way that we read Genesis? Yeah. Because I know for me personally, and for others who maybe are starting to study Genesis deeper, they may see it as just a creation story that someone was writing down the details of how it all really happened, and not understanding that it could be a polemic to other creation narratives. So could you talk about that a little bit, and how much do we consider those? Is it worth reading those? Does it affect the Genesis creation story? Talk about that.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's a fun question. This one comes up a lot, right? It's one of these that people are really interested in knowing. Is Genesis 1, and especially Genesis 1, is it simply critiquing the other ancient Near Eastern stories? Is it a polemic, like you're saying? Is that all it really is? Is it really just coming after Enuma Elish or going after any of the other creation myths that we have out there? I would say this. It's yes and no, ultimately, is what you have happening here. Now, I want to be clear again, and there's a lot of debate around this within Hebrew Bible scholarship. So you're going to get a whole spectrum of thought on this particular question and topic. That some would just say, oh, they're absolutely borrowing and critiquing these ancient Near Eastern myths. You'll get others who will then you'll do the comparative work, and you'll be like, okay, are they even related? So you'll get a whole swing back the other way. And so what I want to say is first and foremost this. We tend to think that ancient Israel is just so other and so different from all the nations around them that any sort of comparison that we see there, that they must have just borrowed or something to that effect. But we forget that Abraham actually comes from Ur of the Chaldeans. Now, there's also debate that he could be from a different Ur, but we'll leave that aside for now. So he comes, we'll just say, from southern Mesopotamia, what would be present-day Iraq. So the Lord took a Mesopotamian and called him out, and out of that he brings forth, that is, the Lord brings forth out of Abraham and his descendants, ancient Israel, and what becomes the Israelite traditions. Now, he's going to work within that culture. That's exactly what the Lord does. He's working within that particular culture. And so one of the best things that you can do when it comes to the other ancient Near Eastern creation stories is to compare themes as opposed to trying to figure out how the borrowing has happened. Now, you could do that on some linguistic levels about the borrowing, but the thematic elements are far more interesting. There's a lot regarding darkness, a lot regarding light throughout these creation stories, a lot regarding the fact that there's waters below and waters above. This sort of thing. The sort of cosmic geography of the Near East, which is the way one of my professors at the Hebrew University has a great book called Cosmic Geography, in fact. And in there, he just talks about the Near Eastern, takes the Near Eastern text, talks about the way that Near Easterners understood the cosmic geography. And you see it in ancient Israel. You even see it then into the New Testament with sort of this three-tiered heaven that shows up sometimes, obviously with the Apostle Paul saying he was caught up. And anyways, the point is that those sorts of themes are all throughout. Now let's focus in on, for example, you have in verse 2 of Genesis 1:2, you have Ve'ha'aretz haita tohu vavohu, and then it says this, so, and the earth was tohu vavohu, and then it says Ve'choshek al panei tehom. So then it says, and darkness was on the face of the deep, or on the deep. Covered or hover, So this tehom, some would want to say linguistically it's connected to Tiamatum from Akkadian, which is Tiamat, the god of the one of the gods of the waters, and that you would have then a comparison there. Well, you can just as easily on a linguistic level make an argument that it's not related to Tiamat, and that it might actually be coming from a West Semitic or Northwest Semitic route, and you would go the route of looking up at, say, Ugarit, which was a city-state right around the 15th to the 13th century BCE, right before the collapse of the Near East in 1150. Ugarit's very important for sort of looking at Northwest Semitic religious traditions, and you might be able to make a connection that direction with Tehom and take it away from Enuma Elish. But the point is, the deeps of the waters and darkness, like that's really what the comparison is that you could look at. And out of this, and this is really, I think, what the Near Easterners are after, they want to know how things came to order and to function. And that's at the very heart of what Near Eastern texts are looking for. In Egyptian text, you have Ma'at, you have this goddess. And there is connection to order with Ma'at and wisdom sort of tied up in that. In Enuma Elish, if we look at Enuma Elish, the Mesopotamian creation narrative, it's not really a creation narrative. That's the irony of this discussion, is most scholars will tell you Enuma Elish isn't really a creation narrative. It's about how Marduk, the supreme god of the Babylonian pantheon, how Marduk came to be the supreme god of the Babylonian pantheon. And so how does he do it? Well, he does it through combat. He does it through dispelling and coming after the forces of chaos. And then he orders the present world. And that is very close to Genesis 1, except we don't have chaos as an enemy to the Lord. We just have the Lord creating and ordering. And that's really what you have from Genesis 1 to 7, Genesis 1 to 2:4a, that first creation story. And we see then at the very end of Genesis 1, what happens, Chandler? You have the Lord resting, right? So you have the Lord resting after all of his creation, and he is supreme over all creation. So again, those themes work between the creation narratives. But you don't have to argue that there is necessarily borrowing. That said, this is an absolute polemic in the sense that it does critique the other creation narratives, and it gives a frame for ancient Israel in their own living and in their own faith for understanding from where it is that they come. It comes from the one God who created everything and who brought everything to functional order. And the last thing I'm going to say about that is that there are instances in which we have in the Near East that temples could be dedicated in 7 days, or brought to through ritual, brought to function, and you would even have also this resting motif within that temple theology, and you certainly have that here in Genesis 1, that the Lord is resting in his cosmic temple, in which he's brought high order that can sustain life ultimately.
Yeah.
So all that to say, I think the themes are what you want to go after in those comparative stories. But we shouldn't be surprised. Ancient Israelites are Near Easterners. These themes are there. There's going to be lots of similarities between creation narratives in the Near East and between Genesis 1. And there's going to be a lot of differences as well.
That's so helpful. Okay. This is one that I've thought about a lot, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So a few different questions. So I'll just ask them, and then if you need me to re-ask them, because it's a lot, then I'd love to hear your thoughts. So the first one is, does the Hebrew text itself give us any reason to think the earth is young or old? So kind of going into different creation theories, young earth, old earth, so on and so forth. What are your thoughts on that? But also, which one do you find the most convincing? And then I have a third question, but I'll wait until you talk about those two first.
Yeah. So it's good. I don't think these questions are being asked of Genesis 1 through 11 ultimately. Like, I don't know that they care to answer this question, and
Okay.
I'm pretty clear of that. Now, what you can do, the better question I think is, you would say, well, how old is humanity? Because that's really what Genesis 1 through 11, or I should say what we will get from the Bible itself, is there's going to be a claim of genealogical time. And it's that claim that forces the 6,000-year-old young earth creationism that some will read into this. And like I said, I'm not going to give a critique on that or not. What I am going to say is that you got 2,000 years from Adam to Abraham, 2,000 years from Abraham to Christ, 2,000 years from Christ to us, right? So you get that 6,000-year paradigm. What's really interesting on the genealogical element with the Hebrew Bible and even the Jewish calendar and the dating of the Jewish calendar is it seems to go right almost. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's very close to the dawn of writing itself. So like I will tell my students all the time, I'll say, well, history is 6,000 years old. And what I mean is that really we started writing down history about 6,000 years ago. Because you don't have history. When we talk about history proper, history is the writing down of human events and reflecting upon the past through that written tradition. Well, that's 6,000-year-old tradition. And it's interesting to me that the Hebrew Bible goes back on a genealogical level to about that particular time. However, I want to be clear, is that when it comes to the genealogical list, you have someone like the late Kenneth Kitchen, who really knew the Near Eastern textual traditions and the history better than anyone alive during his time. He just recently passed away. Great evangelical scholar. And he would say that, there could be gaps in the genealogies themselves, right? I mean, there's no reason why we can't think that there isn't some sort of gap in those genealogies. And so, no, the earth, again, Genesis 1 through 11 is not making a claim on any of that. It's just that we have in our genealogical time that point being made. So like I said, I like to tell my students, history goes back to about 6,000 years, because that's when writing began. Now we know Jericho goes back to about 9,000 years through the archaeological record. We know that economic transactions and the keeping of economics was happening for quite some time, about 4,000 to 5,000 years, roughly, up until the dawn of writing with cuneiform. It's how cuneiform ever began to be written down through the Sumerians. It was really through this economic keeping that was happening. I know some very good evangelical scientists, who are suggesting that that humanity could go back a long ways, like maybe 500,000 years old, or even a million years old, in a sense. And
Mm.
they're not theistic evolutionary sorts of people. Like they just think that the evidence might suggest that humanity's a lot older than we understand. So again, I'm leaving all that out there. What I want to say, because I'm not a scientist, I'm
Hmm.
happy to agree with modern day science, but I'm just letting everyone know that Genesis 1 through 11, its time is capped at 6,000 years because of the genealogical time and claim that it is making in that level. So,
Mm. That's so helpful. Yeah. And the reason I ask that, which is kind of my third question or thought, which I'd
yeah,
love to hear you speak to, is a lot of the times when I'm talking with atheists or agnostics about, or people of other religions, there seems to be this tendency, specifically with atheists, where they get tripped up over Genesis and those first two chapters there
yeah,
specifically, maybe chapter 3 as well, but specifically chapter 1, and they tend to, like you said, they're asking questions that the text doesn't seem to be claiming. And I think it's interesting that you said that, because they seem to try and want and answer a specific timeline, and specifically those who are, who they consider themselves young Earth creationists, or young Earthers. The atheists would look at them and say they're crazy. And, even conversations that I've had, I've just thought that that conversation was worth looking into. But I like what you said about how that's not the claim, that's not necessarily what the narrative is trying to say. So have you ever had any experiences, just really briefly, with people who seem to go back to Genesis in terms of what it's speaking to about how the earth came to be and how the things were created, and that poses a stumbling block for them?
yeah. I mean, because when you read the text and don't read it and try to read it as the ancients would have understood it, it can cause it can cause obviously issues in understanding what it's actually trying to convey as far as meaning is concerned. And that's the point with Genesis 1 itself. It's it's trying to tell us a story about the Lord bringing everything to order and resting in his sort of cosmic temple, and he's created images, like, apart from time. Like I just said, that to be the tselem of the Lord is to in fact be the image of the Lord, is to in fact be his offspring in a sense. And there's no doubt that that's what's coming through in the text with the image of God. So I would say to anyone for whom it is a stumbling block, it's important that you try to read it as the ancients would, and not assume that their philosophical assumptions or their assumptions grounded within our understanding of post enlightened science is at all what they were trying to convey.
Mm.
I don't think it just as much as the windows of heaven open and rain comes down. I mean, they really thought, in some sense, that there was water up in the sky, and it would come down. It was being held back. You have that within much of the reading. Now, you could argue that that's a rote literalism, and you just think that's what the Near Easterners thought. You're being too literal with the Near Easterners. Maybe they didn't think that. You could just as
Hmm.
well argue that. But there's enough evidence that might suggest that that is what was thought, and that's just not how it is. So yeah, so these things I think matter. Now you get to, for example, the 7 day creation narrative. Was it a literal 7 days? And to what does that refer when it comes to creation and ordering? You have in Exodus, for example, that the reason there's a Sabbath is because the Lord created the earth in 7 days, and so you have to create. You have to have your 6 days of work and have the seventh as the holy Sabbath. And the Sabbath is a great sign within the creational narrative. And so that really does matter for ancient Israel. I have no doubt that they wouldn't have thought that the Lord created the world in 7 days. But some
Hmm.
would argue, like John Walton and others, that the real point of Genesis 1 is ordering. that it's bringing to function. It's not even really about bringing matter out of nothing. So John Walton has a really interesting take on this. Whether or not Professor Walton is correct on it is another question, but I think his thought here is really fascinating on the point that it has not that though ancient Israelites would have believed that God brought everything out of nothing and that he created everything, that the real point of Genesis 1, though, is function and order. How did we get from tohu vavohu, which is a place of complete dysfunction where no life can exist, and yet it is a place that exists, tohu vavohu. How does that become the world that we now have? And so there's that. As far as time and prehistory, Mesopotamians with the Sumerian king list, I mean, they got humans going back 220,000 years, which lines up really interesting with some of the present day scientific narrative. But I will say, when it comes to prehistory, it's very interpretive. There's a lot of speculation that goes on here. And I often just tell students that, I'll just be like, well, we don't even quite fully understand time as a concept at the moment. Theoretical physics is having quite a heyday with time itself. So there's a lot there. There's a lot of mystery. I'll say that. There's a lot of mystery when it comes to the ancient past. I often think of deep space and ancient history as synonymous. We can observe deep space, but we can't really get to it. We can observe ancient history, but we're sort of separated from it, and so there's just a lot. There's a lot of mystery going on here. One day we shall know for sure. So,
yeah, so fascinating. So you talked about it there for a second, which segues perfect into my next question. Is that phrase there in Genesis 1:2, tohu vavohu?
Yes.
I have a lot of questions, a lot of different ways that my brain kind of goes when I'm thinking of this, but I did a paper on this for Dr. Lyons, and as you had mentioned, it seems like there is this place that is existent, but it's chaotic, it's uninhabitable, and like you said, Professor Walton seems to suggest that God comes and speaks order to it. So I wanted to ask you, do you feel like this can open up the way for a pre-Adamic race, where there is something that is on this earth, that's something that's there before, which I could keep asking questions about the fall of Satan, and as we would know. Yeah. But what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on tohu vavohu? Could you press a little deeper? But also, what are your thoughts on a pre-Adamic race?
Yeah. No, it's good. That's a good question. So, there are a lot that obviously this has been a theory for some time that because but again, this depends on how you translate Genesis 1. Is it in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, full stop, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. But if you say when God began to create the heavens and the earth, then it's logical that the next verse would be, and basically that the earth is tohu vavohu. Now, for many, and you can tell me, you did a study on this. So with tohu vavohu, often it can be a reference to situations of judgment, that something ends up in tohu vavohu because of judgment passages that we might have in the Hebrew Bible. And so we have very rare instances of this. But I like Professor Walton. He will, you can see where tohu vavohu can even be referring to, he'll often use the imagery of like a wilderness, that though it's a place of existence, the place itself it can't inhabit, there's no way that life can inhabit that particular place. And that's really the description of tohu vavohu. I don't think that there can be a pre-Adamic race here. And here's why. I would expect the text to tell us that there was a pre-Adamic race if there was one. So we're really filling in the gaps on one level, as opposed to letting the text be the text. It's just not there. And I don't think the text would have an issue, especially when you finally get to Genesis 6 and you have these, Come on, I have to bring up the Nephilim at some point, right? Just
Yes.
everybody likes it when you bring it up. So that when you get to Genesis 6, you have the sons of God. They take human wives, they bear children, and these are the Nephilim. So the Genesis 6 has no problem existing. I mean, it's there. It's in the text. It's a very sort of strange story. In fact, this would be sort of what you would think of as the pre-Adamic race. Ultimately, what I've heard preachers try to preach in talking about demonology and some of that the pre-Adamic race has some part in that. Second Temple Jews never thought that way. They were going back through Enoch, going back to Genesis 6, suggesting that the departed spirits of the Nephilim were in fact the demons of the day. And so it's in that particular way that you have a real textual argument because it's there in the text. So no, I don't think there's a pre-Adamic race, but there is already, and we have it in Job, for example. It says that the host of heaven and the sons of God rejoiced when the Lord began to create the heavens and the earth, right? When he began to bring everything to high order. And there we're already told that there are beings that exist that he's created who are rejoicing over creation. So it's not a pre-Adamic race, but it seems to be the angels of God, if you will, from a Christian standpoint. But the way that the Hebrew text says is the B'nai Elohim, right? The sons of God in that sense. So yeah, I think Tohu Vavohu is telling us that the Lord is the great builder. He's the great creator, and he's going to bring out of chaos, out of a place of non-existence, high order, something that you might describe as tov, good, or that you might describe as shalom, a place of high peace, in which life can be sustained. Essentially, the Lord's creating that cosmic temple, and what's he going to do? He's going to create images of himself, his offspring, his image, which the counterpart in the Near East to the image, of course, is the idol statue, right? So that's the counterpart to the image in Genesis 1, is the way that the idols they believed the presence of those deities living in those idol statues, animating those statues. They would feed them, they would clothe those statues. The counter, obviously, to that is Genesis 1's image of God, image of the Lord, the God of Israel. And he creates his cosmic temple. And where do you put an image of a God in the Near East? You put it in a temple, essentially. And so that is what is happening here. And so, again, I think if there was a pre-Adamic race, the text would have no issue telling us that there was one. So then you ask, well, where's the fall of Satan? Well, we don't know. What we do know is that there is a Nachash that shows up in Genesis 2 and 3, and that figure is already in rebellion to the Lord and what he's doing. It's probably that he doesn't like that his offspring are the humans, and he's going to go after them quite ferociously.
That's so good. I was looking at different things because I don't know if we'll have time, but I was looking at some of the infamous passages about Ezekiel. I think it's in chapter 28 with the king. Is it Tyre?
Yeah, of Tyre.
Tyre.
Yeah.
Tyre. Some people thinking that is Satan's fall, and then in Luke where Jesus is talking about how I saw Satan fall like lightning. So many things.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you this. I was reading this, and I guess I'll find out really quick if it holds any water or not. But Genesis chapter 2, verse 20. I was talking with a pastor who loves Bible stuff 2 days ago on the podcast, and I presented this to him. But I said, you know what? I'm going to have Dr. French on in 2 days, so I'll find out if it holds any water or not. Genesis chapter 2, verse 20. So I've been slowly going through Genesis, just reading through and trying to study. And I got Robert Alter up here looking through his stuff. And so Genesis chapter 2, verse 20, it seems like Adam is living out this dominion that God had given him. And in this story, and in verse 19 as well, it says, the Lord God formed out of the ground every wild animal and every bird of the sky and brought to each them to the man to see what he would call it. And whatever the man called a living creature, that was its name. And then verse 20, the man gave names to all the livestock, to the birds of the sky, and to every wild animal. And then this is the part that I wanted to ask you about. It seems like there's a sudden shift, and it says, but for the man, no helper was found corresponding to him. And then it stops, goes into the passage of him, the Lord bringing deep sleep on him. But then in Genesis 3, verse 1, it immediately, I think, may pick back up. And it says, or I think it's interesting how it starts. Now the serpent was the most cunning of all the wild animals that the Lord God had made. So I don't know if this is me just being too pictorial in my brain.
Yeah.
Dr. French, what are your thoughts on this idea that in Genesis chapter 2, verse 20, that maybe God was bringing to him these different creatures, these different animals, and at one point he had brought him the serpent, and while Adam was exercising dominion, naming the different beasts and the different creatures, at one point God had presented him the serpent of Genesis 3:1, but Adam didn't know the craftiness and what would happen with this serpent eventually. And that could be why there's a cut. God gives him a helper, which I'd be curious what your thoughts on are, what your thoughts are on that Hebrew word for helper. And then it seems like it picks back up, and then it's the Genesis 3 story. So my question is it possible that God had brought to him the serpent of Genesis 3? Adam had named it, but not known what this serpent was capable of. And then comes the story with Eve, and then picks back up what I think may be where it left off in Genesis 2:20 in the second part of that verse. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. No, I've never thought about asking the question of how do we go from 20 where he's naming the animals, and then we have this moment of the woman being created, and then we're just right there with the Nachash in Genesis 3. That's a really fascinating question. There's no doubt he named the Nachash, right? There's no doubt that he did, because I mean that's what it says. And man gave names to all the cattle and to the birds of the sky and to all the wild beasts, right? So the Chayat. So we have it right there that he has given names to all the Chayat Hasadeh, and the Nachash is the wisest or the craftiest of all the Chayat Hasadeh. And so there's a real question there there's a lot of questions around what the Nachash is and is not within the text. But I think you're bringing up something really interesting. With verse 20, it says the Vayikra. So Vayikra ha'adam shemot lekol behema. So in this case, and the man called, and the man gave names. So it doesn't really, the translation, even in the JPS, and the man gave names, and the NET, so the man named all the animals. When I hear Vayikra, I'm like, okay, all right, we're at levels of the Lord himself at this point, right? Because the Lord, he calls the light Yom, and he calls the night or the darkness Laila, calls it night. And so it is Vayikra. And then, of course, when you finally get to Leviticus, what's the name of Leviticus in Hebrew? It's Vayikra. And the Lord called to Moses from the tent. It's a call of holiness. And so the fact that the man is participating in this Vayikra, in this calling something and naming it, I think is really, really important. It shows that the man is very much like the Lord himself. But there is no story here in which he brought the serpent, but nevertheless, he would have named the serpent. And I think it's an interesting question that you're asking is, why do we go from naming the animals to then the woman being made? Then all of a sudden, we're right at Genesis 3:1. And Genesis 2:25, which is that the man and the woman are naked and they're not ashamed. That there is in 225. It says that, and the both of them, vayihu shnehem, are arumim, right? So they are naked, arumim, coming from arom, which means naked. And in the next verse, the nachash is arum, coming from arum, which means shrewd. So there's a wordplay between the fact that the humans are naked and the fact that the nachash is wise, and so or shrewd in this sense. And so there very well could be something happening there. But your question on the Ezer Kenegdo of the woman, that she is created, that he found no companion, or in this case, he found no fitting helper in Ezer Kenegdo. So this is what's really interesting here, is that Ezer language is often referring and used of the Lord. He's the great Ozer. He's the great helper of Israel in the Hebrew Bible. And so it's a place of just such high honor within ancient Israelite thinking. We have it here as well. And the man knew that he did not have one like him, essentially. And this is important because what will come is the Nachash trying to disrupt this relationship between the man and the woman. And this is at the very heart, I think, of the polemic that Genesis 2-3 is pushing back on the other ancient Near Eastern religions. I think this one's very intentional. You can't create a statue of the Lord, of Yahweh. It's forbidden. It's forbidden in the Exodus, in the Ten Commandments, right? You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not create any images. So you can't create an image of a god, and there is no image of Yahweh in the Israelite religion. There's no image of the Lord, no statue that you can go bow down to. Why? Because the humans are the statue, right? They are the very image of the Lord. They are his kin in this sense. Well, how are they going to create? How do you create images? You know, in the Near East, you created images. You got your wood or you got your stone and you fashioned your image. It then went through a ritual. You put it in a river and it go through sometimes a 7-day ritual, sometimes other day rituals, the Mispi and the Pitpi ritual, the opening of the washing of the mouth and the opening of the mouth ritual, that they thought the statue would come to life and all that. Well, you have that all happening right there in Genesis 2-3. And here his Ezer Kenegdo, the two of them shall come together. They shall become one flesh. And it is through their marriage and their coming together, through their consummation, that we'll find in Genesis 4:1 with the woman, where it says that that Adam will know his wife and she will conceive, and she does conceive, and it says that she says this. She says, "Kaniti ish et Adonai." I have created a man with Adonai, with the Lord. And it shows right there that in a real sort of critique of Near Eastern thinking on images of the gods, that in this particular story, it is man and woman in marriage through which images of the Lord are created and through which images of the Lord come forth. That is, progeny, the image of the Lord himself comes through marriage. And it's such a heavy critique of the sort of Near Eastern way of creating physical statues and worshiping them, that I think we sort of miss what's really happening there with the Ezer Kenegdo, and that she is a helpmate, but a helpmate to what? To bring forth images, to bring forth children, to bring forth the images of the Lord himself into the world, and that this goes well beyond just sort of some of your stereotypes. It is at the very foundation of civilization. The man and the woman together building family is at the very heart of this text. And then Nachash, that's exactly what he's going to go after in the next story. Okay, but one last thing I'll say to that is that that when it comes to the Nachash, the story could have ended up differently. If they just would have obeyed the command of Genesis 2:16 and 17, I think the logic of the Eden narrative is simply this: obey the command, You would then be able to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You would receive your divine knowledge, just like the Lord has divine knowledge. Humans would have it. And I think they would push the Nachash out of the garden, is I think what happened there. They should have resisted the Nachash and obeyed their father, who, right, they are his progeny, obeyed their father, as opposed to obeying this Nachash. And then they would have been able to eat from the tree of life, divine knowledge, divine life, living forever together, bringing forth images into the world. So yeah, I think there's a lot of these fun motifs going through.
So good. Yeah. Okay. So maybe one last question, I think, which is a great way to wrap up this discussion. So obviously you'd mentioned at the beginning, Dr. French, some of your credentials and different places that you've studied. You've been studying the scriptures for a while now. And I think it would be helpful for people to hear from you as you've studied deeply linguistics and historical context, and you've done this journey in academics as it pertains to biblical studies. Can people really trust the Hebrew text, the Hebrew Bible? Can they trust it as scriptural? Can they trust it as canonical? And can they place their faith in it, their life in it, that it is what it says it is, and ultimately that it points to the coming Messiah? What are your thoughts on that? Go for it.
So I would say this: yes, the text has the veracity to lead you to the one who gives it its authority, to quote the great the great New Testament scholar. The one who has inspired the text is the one to whom Jesus says this very clearly, right? Jesus says, "You search the scriptures, in them you think you have life, but you don't know that these are they that testify of me." And yes, the textual manuscript tradition, or the tradition of the text itself, is extremely complex. I mean, it's extremely complex when you get into this. And so, I mean, when you ask me that, I'm thinking, okay, we got the Septuagint, we've got the Masoretic text, we have other potential Hebrew traditions that are coming down as well at the same time. The Apostle Paul seems to want to just hold all of this in tension and say, here are the inspired traditions of ancient Israel, right? And when it comes to like original manuscripts, much of that we don't have from the sources of ancient Israel. We have the compiled text that's been given to us, that's been brought together and preserved by ancient Israel and passed down then through the church and through Judaism. And the church has preserved what it has preserved for us. And so the answer is yes, you can trust it. And yes, when you start reading it as the text ought to be read, especially in its ancient context, it will lead you right to Yeshua. So I have my favorite verse in all the Hebrew Bible is Exodus 34:6, and it simply goes like this. It says, "Adonai Elohim El Rachum Vechanun Erech Chapayim Ve'Rav Chesed Ve'emet." It's when the Lord passes by Moses on the cleft of the mountain, right? And this was proclaimed: the Lord, a God who is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in chesed ve'emet, abounding in covenant, faithful love and truth, or faithfulness, however you want to describe this chesed, this going above and beyond anything that the Lord is obligated to do in kindness toward Israel because of the covenant, this chesed, this thing where he creates the world and he gifts his tov into all of creation, not because of obligation, but just because he wants to gift his tov into creation. That chesed ve'emet, that is the descriptor of the God of Israel. It's right there in the second book of the Bible in Exodus. That is the descriptor of who he is, a God of extreme kindness, mercy, and grace and truth. And John's gospel picks up on that in John chapter 1, and he says, the Torah came through Moshe, the Torah came through Moses, but chesed ve'emet, that kindness of the Lord and truth comes through Yeshua, the Messiah. There's no doubt there in John chapter 1 that the writer is going back to Exodus on Sinai and saying the one passing by Moses is Yeshua. It is the Lord. And the one who is in Yeshua is the one passing by Moses. It is the Holy Trinity, as we Christians would say. And so John is making that very clear. So yes, you can believe it, you can trust it. Let the text lead you to the one who stands behind the text, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Wow, that's so beautiful. Yeah, love that. Well, Dr. French, thank you so much for taking over an hour to talk with me about all my questions. I felt like a kid in a candy store.
Well, this was great. It was really fun to be here. So thank you for having me.
Yes, of course. Well, everyone that's watching, make sure that you like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below. What was your favorite part of this episode with Dr. French? Dr. French helps run a podcast called Hebrew Bible Insights. I'll link it down below so you can check it out. You don't have to know Hebrew to listen to it and to follow, but it is a phenomenal podcast. So I'll put that down below so you can check that out. But until next time, thank you all so much for listening and watching the Holy Middle Podcast, and we'll see you later.